Hi, I'm Konrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we talk to Hannah Kent. The South Australian author burst onto the literary scene in 2013 with the publication of her debut historical novel, Burial Rites, about the execution of a young woman in Iceland 2 centuries ago. The book was a global bestseller, optioned by Hollywood, with Jennifer Lawrence reportedly attached to star as the condemned Agnes. Kent's success also gave her that thing that all writers crave. No, not fame and fortune, but the time and space to write. She followed Burial Rites with 2 more masterful works, The Good People and Devotion, not to mention a screenplay for Netflix, and now something different, a memoir. Always Home, Always Homesick walks readers through the early life experience that set Kent on the writing path, following her formative experience as an exchange student in Iceland, the forensic and emotional construction of her smash hit novel, and finally, the ghost who lingers and lives with her still. I'm so pleased that she's in the studio to chat with us about all that and more. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. We met about a decade ago, I think, on the press tour for The Good People. I'm pretty sure you were living in Melbourne's northern suburbs at the time, and you kind of talked about the importance of experiencing the world intensely and your sadness that we're all sort of less in tune with the earth than we once were. And that made me think at the time of the Adelaide Hills, where you kind of wanted to be. And where you grew up, quite outdoorsy on 8 acres with a dam and sheep and a swing from an old oak tree, a very sort of exterior life. Can you tell listeners how you came to the internal world of writing, having grown up in that expansive sort of place?
You know, it was funny. I don't really think of reading or writing and the outside world as being disconnected in any way. For me, they are very much integrated. I grew up, like you say, in beautiful Paramount country in the Adelaide Hills, and from a very young age was introduced to the beauty of the world that surrounded me, particularly by my father, but also my mother. They both grew up in a small town. They had childhoods of swimming in the river. They spent a lot of their life outside. And so from, being a toddler, the outside world and the natural world felt like a very safe place to be. It felt like a place where I could reflect. I was encouraged to reflect outside. And then when I started reading, and I found in words and I found in stories a kind of magic, not so much an escape from the worlds in which I existed, but an amplification of the wonder that was around me, then it felt like something that I too wanted to wield. If stories and the natural world were wondrous and if they filled me with awe, then I wanted to be able to learn how to do this thing too. I wanted to be able to give that to other people. So in some ways, it's only recently that I've been reflecting about how all of these things have come together, how all these elements of my life have sort of harmonized. But I do think now that that's probably a big part of it. It was my early love of storytelling, my association with it, with the natural world, and then my desire to offer that same kind of magic to other people, to make them notice what was around them and to also amplify their wonder in it.
I remember talking to your sister, Bryony.
Yeah, Bryony.
And her strongest memories were of building cubbies with sticks and kind of pretending that you were witches, making potions out of leaves and lichen and rocks or whatever you could forage in that space. You're back there now and you have 2 children of your own.
I do.
Anouk and Rory. Have you consciously tried to recreate the same sort of wondrous experience in childhood?
Definitely. I think particularly when they were young, I was like, okay, now I have to facilitate this for them. And I think what I've learned, Rory's just turned 5 and Anouk is 7 now. And I think what I've learned in the experience of being a parent is that, the kids find their own way. I think children naturally are drawn to beautiful, exciting, wondrous things, even things that we as adults might not necessarily perceive as being particularly interesting. Kids find their own ways to relate to the world. They find their own ways of noticing. And one of the joys I found is like I might, on one rainy day, I remember this happened recently. I was like, it's raining. We haven't had rain in ages. It's been a very dry summer up in the Adelaide Hills. I'm like, let's get on our rain jackets. And I basically just marched them through pelting rain for
Awesome.
5Ks. And, I was thinking, they're going to love the puddle jumping. They were pretty miserable, honestly, for most of it.
Right.
But in the last half hour, they started noticing bubbles in the road. It's just probably from the buildup of detergent and pollutants. And they were suddenly so fascinated by these. And I'd completely disregarded it. By this stage, I was like, no, we've got to get home. We're going to go over this crest. I was so focused on directions. I was so focused on other things of like, look at this beautiful vista, which they had no interest in. But instead, I got to see that, their child eyes find their own things that interest them. And then I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's kind of extraordinary. They look amazing. Look at the way they refract the light. So it's always humbling, I think, to be a parent. You think, I've got, my kids are going to grow up this way. But no, they find their own means.
I love that you tried to get them out in the rain. There's a really nice passage in your book about you waiting to get on a swing and all the kids in front of you kind of not letting you have that chance. And then the rain comes down. It's like, finally, my chance is here. And you're sitting on that swing getting pelted until the teachers pull you in.
Oh, I loved it. I've always loved the rain. I've always loved, I don't know, this, a really windy day. I have another really core memory from when I was about 5 years old of the wind blowing so hard, and I was in the playground at my school and all the kids are shrieking, and I just felt like I could lean into it. Like I felt like I was about to fly. Yeah, it's amazing. I love that. I love the wild weather.
Just on children and birth, and please bear with me here, long question.
Yeah.
Your friend and former colleague, Rebecca Stafford, with whom you founded the literary journal Kill Your Darlings, once described to me writing a book as being like childbirth. She said, you forget what it felt like the first time, which is why you're happy to do it the next time. Now, you've written about birth in your books. If I remember correctly, you even sort of consulted ancient midwifery guides in order to sort of greater understand what it would have been like at the time.
Yes.
But now, of course, you've had your own experience of that human event. You even talk about it quite vividly in the memoir about the sort of harrowing emergency of one of your birth experiences. You kind of, your knuckles bloodied from punching the hospital bed. Is it different now to write about that, having had the experience?
I don't think so. No, I think I was expecting it to be. When you finally have these intimate personal experiences, you feel, or maybe you hope that they're going to cast a new insight, or maybe just a greater familiarity with them. I think what happened instead was that I had spent so much time, like you say, looking up in various contexts, the history of midwifery and the various experiences of women. And I felt that knowledge and that kind of familiarity, even on an intellectual level, was kind of with me when I then had my own experiences. And in the case of my daughter's birth, my first experience, I absolutely had that in mind because there was an instance where things got quite precarious and there was a practitioner who was being, without getting into it, basically didn't think that it was, and then it did suddenly become that way. And I remember my first instinct when I thought, this isn't right, thinking of everything I had read and just how extreme this experience has been for women throughout the years. So I think whilst that didn't necessarily frighten me, it helped me listen to my own intuition, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think there's certain physical experiences that giving birth, provide you a familiarity with, but I would say that it's not necessarily something that I was wholly ignorant of. I feel actually that if you listen to the stories of other people, you can absolutely get a very, very strong sense of things as they were and are and continue to be.
I love asking writers questions about process, how they go about doing it. And I remember when I asked you about it the first time, you kind of reflected that you were very fastidious about routine, kind of protective even of your writing routine. You were up at 6:30, feed the pets, make coffee, have brekkie. Then you're into the study and the desk and the windows in front of you, and there's some music or maybe the reassuring babble of like Swedish radio or something playing. You've got a cat asleep at your feet and a dog asleep at your feet as well. You have phone reminders to take a break at 10:30 a.m. and 1 p.m. Otherwise, you won't. And this set goal of like 1,000 words per day. Do you still have that kind of rigorous routine or regimen?
Oh my God, no. I wish. I was just reminiscing when you were saying that, thinking, oh my God, the good old days. I remember that, far out. I had no responsibilities. No, my writing life has been completely different pretty much since I fell pregnant. In wonderful ways too, but I think there was definitely a period in my life when my children were very young. Both were terrible sleepers. My daughter's only just started sleeping through the night at 7 years old.
Oh, God.
Hard for her as well,
Yeah.
absolutely. But, it has a ripple effect upon your entire day, kind of extraordinary fatigue. And also just the responsibility of looking after very little people and also wanting to spend time with them. But there was a period of time where I felt very disoriented and very disconnected from a creative practice probably because I had been so strict in my routines and so narrow in my concept of discipline. And I think probably it took me a good 5 years to find out that actually they weren't as necessary as I thought they were, and to find my way back to writing in a wholly new, I wouldn't even call it routine. Practice, yes, perhaps. But this one had to be, snatched hours once the kids were down. It had to be thinking, oh, great, that appointment got cancelled. I'm going to start writing in my notes app on my phone. It's not the Swedish babble and the candle and the, very protected hours. It's in some ways a integrating writing into my life as I'm living it. And so I think for that reason, I have become much more highly focused. It's quite difficult to enter 19th century Prussia with Bluey really loudly through the wall. But, I struggled, but now I can do that. Now I can completely shut down and focus. And it was also a really good exercise, I think, in a reevaluation of priorities, because there were some times when I had to physically kind of pull the blinds down on the window of my study at home because my children were pressing their faces and pulling silly faces and I had a deadline. And I felt terrible. They knew they weren't supposed to disturb me. They'd snuck out. But it was, it makes you, I think, take the losses and the moments of failure a little more lightly because you know that no matter what happens with the writing, you've got this other thing going on. So I think I'd actually say that it's improved me. I think I'm much more flexible. I think in some ways I'm much more disciplined in the sense that I'm unfussy, and I also think that now I don't sweat the small stuff in my writing as much as I once did. But it's completely different, totally different.
You also wrote a screenplay, which I mentioned earlier, for a Netflix kind of psychological thriller / horror movie, Rabbit Run, filmed in Wakery, starring Sarah Snook. You've also worked on screenplays for your novels, The Good People and Devotion. What do you enjoy about that process? I understand it's a bit more kind of collaborative. That must have a kind of push and pull effect, that there would be difficulty in that, but also it must be nice to lean on others too. I also just wonder if it's nice to do something completely different, like a sort of a palate cleanser, if you will, between big, meaty projects.
Oh yeah, all of the above. I think I went in for the opportunity at first because it came knocking on my door and I was surprised and delighted by that. And also because so much of writing and the joy of writing for me comes from the inherent challenges within it. So I was at the stage that I heard from Carver Productions, Anna McLeish and Sarah Shaw, two producers. They approached me and said, we think your writing has a visual sensibility. Have you ever considered writing for film? And at the time, I was on the brink of starting to write another historical novel. I wasn't entirely sure what it was about. I was probably a little sick of the solitude involved in a lot of novel writing. But also I thought, well, yeah, I absolutely would love to do that. That sounds just interesting, mainly because I don't know anything about it. But also, oh yeah, that would be a good challenge. This would be like starting out again. This would be like almost being a debut. And I also have a very strong intuitive sense about things that I want to do. I often just jump in. I can be quite spontaneous in my creative life in ways that I'm not in my private life. But if someone has a great concept or a great project idea and it it enthuses me in the moment, I'm very likely to say yes. And that's exactly what happened. And then as the project unfolded and I learned more about what what being a screenwriter entailed, then I really enjoyed that collaborative aspect. I knew there would be a lot of back and forth, but I really enjoyed being humbled by it in a funny way. With novels, I'm a massive rewriter. I do draft after draft after draft.
God, I remember you describing in the memoir that you dumped 40,000 words at the start of Burial Rites and just started again.
Yes, and I did that with this memoir too. Oh my gosh, I've written it like 3 times over. But that's my process. It's not really as fast as I'd like it to be, but that's just how I work. But then with screenwriting, they were like, all right, go off and, try and write a draft of this thing. And I was like, oh God, I don't really know how to be a screenwriter, and eventually confessed that I didn't really feel equipped. And they said, well, they gave me this beautifully generous comment, which was just write a screenplay as a novelist. So I did that, and I thought it was pretty good. And then, we sort of parked it and we had a meeting, and they're like, so send that through whenever you're ready. And I'm like, oh, I have to show you my first drafts? Like, you have to see my notes? I was like, it's not good. Like, I like the bones, but then they're like, no, you got to show us. And so that was a great learning curve, just kind of thinking, oh my God, I'm just going to have to show this not great, very rough, very unpolished work to these professionals. But I loved that because it really made me, in their grace and the ways in which they received sometimes this very, very hideous drafts, I thought, oh, people understand this creative process. These are creative people who are interested in development and understanding of the various stages of it and what it takes to get to a final production. And I really, really loved that. And it made me all the more willing and interested to continue working with these people who are very invested in creative process. And then working with, the wonderful director, Dana Reed, that was another learning process again. And I loved that. I loved the faith that gets placed in you as a writer, where they say, look, we think it needs this particular beat, or we need something else here. You go do that. I trust that you'll be able to find what it is. I don't need to direct you in what that might be. And then you come back with a bunch of options. They're like, yeah, that's it. That's when you kind of feel that you're vibrating on the same wavelength creatively. That's just so exhilarating. And then I think I take some of that energy back to my novel writing. Yeah.
Another process question. In the memoir, you mentioned doing research for Burial Rites, and there was this day that you spent kind of 3 hours in the National Museum or the National Archives in Iceland and took like 400 photos.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how those images become part of your process. Like, are they pinned to some gigantic wall with thumbtacks? Because it made me think of memoir I read ages ago, Annie Proulx's Bird Cloud, and it was about like the building of her sort of dream home in Wyoming. And she talked about her process, and it was like she had scraps of paper, handwritten notes, photos, drawings, this massive kind of tableau along one wall, consuming a table like the size of an office boardroom table. And she could just kind of go and walk amongst all those notes when she was doing the writing. Is there anything like, what do you do with all of those source materials? How do you keep them ordered?
I don't know if they are ordered, honestly. I keep on trying to find new methods of being organised, but ultimately I just revert to my natural state, which I think is chaos. Certainly with Burial Rites, I had a giant map. I found a very detailed map, and I blew it up in colour, and I stuck it on my wall adjacent to my computer. And then the research photos that I thought had that I wanted to be able to refer to frequently, whether it was to, just remember the textural look of, I don't know, a domestic item in a 19th century Icelandic farm, or whether it was even a photograph of a moment when I had a key revelation by going through the censuses or the microfiche, I would stick it on the map as well. So it was, it gets very much like that. It gets very a beautiful mind, as my friends like to joke. I'm picturing
little pieces of string connecting.
Totally, yeah, absolutely. You look like an absolute maniac. And I'm so interested in other people's creative processes, and sometimes I pick up, things that they do, thinking, oh, this is going to help me even further. So at the moment, I still put everything up on the wall. I like to see it. I'm a very visual person. It's how my memory works. And so I sort of cover my study walls with all these little scraps and notes and photographs. And then I also, I don't know if I'm going to go back to this actually. I don't know how successful it was, but I also keep index notes, the old school kind of index cards.
Okay.
I did this for devotion because there was so much I needed to know and there was also so much information available.
Yeah.
Prior to that, I tend to do a lot of rewriting, again, just to immerse myself in the research. I keep notebooks, and because they're just for me, I, put illustrations in them and little notes to myself. They're sort of part diaries if I go on a research trip, recipes, proverbs, this kind of, I guess, this very broad net that I cast over the time and the people that I'm researching, I sort of drag and dump in these notebooks. And the index cards, though, that was something that I felt I needed to do for very easy reference. But it was so laborious making them. I mean, I really got carried away with just the childlike joy of clipping out bits of notes and like pasting them to cards and then ordering them. Honestly, I don't know if that one's for me. But yeah, all of it, all of the above.
Do they go into a box in the attic, or do they just get cast to...
They get shoved behind books in my bookshelf.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. In the book, this is the new book, I love the way it described the landscape when you first got to Iceland as a 17-year-old. It was all sort of cold and darkness, and you had so many different ways for describing the darkness and the wonder, and how all of that was sort of mixed in with your homesickness. I lived in the US for several years and vividly remember landing in the North Country up near Canada at night when it was covered in snow as well. And it brought back a lot of memories for me, and a similar sort of sense of personal confusion about where I was and what I was doing. Now I kind of, similar to what you've described in your book, I sort of long for that climate and that the muscular sort of heft of the landscape there, these big high peaks and deep glacial lakes, and experiences like the sound of the echoey crack of ice in a frozen lake, or they have ice storms there in winter, and the branches, all of the tiny little branches on the trees get covered in ice, and then in the wind they chime together like little bells.
Wow.
It's just sort of, it's magical. What natural phenomena do you miss most about Iceland, this place that you've been back to so many times? Is it standing on a glacier? Is it soaking in a hot spring? Is it gazing at the northern lights? Like, there's so much to it.
Oh, that's like choosing a favorite child. I don't think I could. But I have to say, I mean, there's a common experience that I have with all of them, which is, I think the beautiful thing in Iceland is that you can see for so far. You can see such great distances. The air is incredibly pure. Someone once said because there's not very much air traffic. So I think that allows you to see further than you often, that you might be accustomed to.
Big sky.
Big skies. We have them here as well. But also there's a lack of trees. They're increasingly planting them. But for the most part, when you're standing in the natural environment, when you're standing in nature and you're looking out, you can see vast distances. You can see the contours of the landscape. You can see just how great and sort of awe-inspiring the weather and the play of light is upon it. Like, you see rain moving through, in the distance. And my sort of emotional response to that, outside of being, wow, how beautiful, is also, oh, wow, look how small you are and look how inconsequential you are. Not in a bad way at all, in a fantastic way, in a way that you feel like you are, there's nothing special about you, but actually that's what connects you to everything. So it is this incredible feeling of communion with your natural environment, and actually a deep feeling of belonging, that you're not something which is apart from this. You're a tiny, tiny speck of something which is much greater than you'll ever understand. Almost kind of a spiritual response, I guess people might say. And I think probably the most elevated experience of that emotion, that kind of, both intellectual and emotional response, would probably be with the Northern Lights. I saw them so much, and I have since, every time I've gone to Iceland, but there have been a couple of nights where they have been particularly strong and have gone on for hours and hours. And it's, I don't know, it's like going into a trance for that time. You feel like you've, I don't know, taken some sort of mind-altering drug. It's a massive sort of trip. And I loved it. I love that so much. So yeah, if I had to choose anything, I'd probably choose that again.
It does seem like the landscape sort of unlocked something in your psyche. In the memoir, you describe this conversation with a woman who I think you were billeted out with for a night, and it was this chat you had with her about ghosts. and their presence in Iceland. This is what you wrote. Even in my few months of living here, I have seen how the wind moves the snow along the ground at night like a spirit looking for rest, how sometimes the mountains seem to possess faces, and how the wind can carry sound like a crying child. Iceland feels like a place where ghosts abide. There is another air here. The boundaries feel permeable somehow. So my question then is a simple one, but maybe with a complicated answer. Like, do you believe in spirits?
Yeah, I do. I believe in energy, as sort of woo-woo as that sounds. But I mean, I do believe in it without claiming to understand it, or without claiming to have a very specific understanding of how these things might operate on the world. I believe in spirits and I believe in ghosts insofar as they exist and live in people, even if that's through an act of imagination. Yep. In the same way that a placebo effect is still an effect, right?
Yep.
People can still be haunted even if ghosts don't, scientifically exist. I have several family members who have had very intense and frequent experiences with ghosts, and I've always been so interested in ghost stories. When I was in Iceland, I was fascinated by a very specific Icelandic ghost as it exists in their mythologies, in their folk tales. In Iceland, ghosts are not this sort of vapor in the background. They're often corporeal. They can move things around. They often have, bad intent. They can kill you. And I was fascinated by that and by how much, ghosts were an embodiment of the fears of the people, which is always what they are. They're, ghosts are a projection of so much of what we feel. And ghost stories always say so much more about the people telling them than the ghosts themselves. So yeah, but yes, I feel like as much as I would love to be like, oh no, clearly not. They're just, this fabrication no, I've heard way too many ghost stories and I've been too chilled out and freaked out by moments of bizarre happenings and coincidences to write them off completely.
Absolutely. There's another passage in your book where you're describing dreams, and can I just say some of your dreams sound absolutely horrifying at different times. This one, you've woken up after a dream of having your throat cut and feeling the warmth of your own blood on your chest. It's terrifying. But what interests me is you wake up and you want to capture that moment, but you don't want to capture it in words, so you draw it instead. Are you somebody that practices drawing and sketching? Is that like part of what you do? And I don't know, does it unlock a different kind of creativity? Or what do you do with that drawing, by the way? Where's that?
I love drawing. I loved art. I studied it in year 12. I love working with charcoal particularly, but also I don't think I would ever pursue it in a vocational sense, but it's definitely something which I see as connected to writing. Sometimes it's more helpful in trying to... It gestures towards feeling sometimes, whereas for me, so much of writing is about trying to achieve a kind of a perfect distillation or an articulation of something I wish to express. Sometimes I don't know what that is yet. So drawing sort of, to me, allows for a more nebulous connection, a more nebulous or, a more, I'll leave it there, a more nebulous connection to what it is that's niggling at me or an experience. But yeah, I still draw quite a lot. My daughter is an incredible artist. She loves it. It's her favorite thing in the world to do. And she's always asking me to draw with her. And that's been lovely, actually. That's as so often happens when you're a parent. You're given permission and an avenue to return to things that you loved when you were younger. So I've been doing a lot more drawing. And it's wonderful. I think it helps my writing in the same way that writing poetry or just doing playful word exercises helps too. It's just part of the play. Yeah. It's just, part of just being creative without, stakes resting on it, without there necessarily needing to be a specific output. And that's a wonderful way to stoke the fires, I think.
Fantastic. I feel like I should give it a shot myself. I used to be really into drawing as a kid, and my son he's 12, and we found this old draftsman sort of table in the hard rubbish recently with really rusty metal base and then a top that needed sanding down, and so we sanded it down and stained it up and lacquered it and everything, and now it sits in a corner with a stool, and he's got all of his art supplies, and he's like a pig in mud sitting there drawing away. I feel like I should pull up a stool with him and have a sketch.
It's something really lovely that, she's demanded it of me, and now that we've started, I love it. But you should absolutely do that. Yeah, hard recommend.
Speaking of spirits, writing about the Agnes of your imagination, you note that there's there's truth in your approximation of her, just as there's truth in the, just as it's one of many truths and potentially one of many falsehoods, because there are so many parts of the historical record, as you describe it, that conflict or are different or are just outright false. The only difference, or one of the differences that I see, though, is the kind of scope and reach of your truth, that your truth is sent out into the world, that it's become a bestseller, right? And that it will potentially become a film. And then it kind of becomes the established, albeit unofficial, truth. Like, how do you feel about that? Like, how do you reconcile having kind of the final word in many ways?
Oh, that's a good question. I do think about it a great deal. I'm very grateful to, my younger self when I started deciding how I was going to write this book, for choosing a quite laborious path. When I started writing Burial Rites, it was going to, it was a component of a thesis. I thought, my mum and 2 examiners would read it, so I could kind of do what I wanted with it. But even at that early stage, I felt a very strong, ethical obligation to do the work. I was very aware of myself as an outsider, writing about a culture that I did not grow up in, around a nationality and a nation of which I don't have a passport. I'm not a citizen of that place. In many ways, I am a stranger and I'm an outsider. But I felt that, there was a period of time where, first of all, I weighed up whether or not I was someone who had a right to this story. I felt that I did, because I felt that my perspective was necessary. I felt that it was a balancing perspective. And I also actually thought, well, you may be an outsider, but often outsiders have, being on the periphery, you've got the greatest view.
Yeah.
And I also thought, well, if you speak the language, you don't have a passing interest. This is a place that means a great deal to you. You have, a kind of self-perceived integrity within your intent. But all the same, you should really make sure that you get it right. And so I did 18 months of very intensive research, and that included not only researching the events of, that I was writing about, but it also included an understanding of 19th century Icelandic life, social life, economic forces, political events. And so I did. That's what I did. And I became completely obsessed, and I think acquired a pretty decent level of familiarity and knowledge of that time. And then, of course, when the book kind of came out and was published in the way it did, I started hearing from Icelanders, and I started hearing from relatives of the people whose ancestors were portrayed in the book. And all of them, even if they perhaps disagreed with my representation, or the subjective representation of certain events, said, but it's clear that you've done the work, you've studied it, and Yeah. And then also, when I was in Iceland for the Icelandic translation, Icelanders have this weekly book show, and which is wonderful for such a small nation. And I was invited to go on it, and I was in hair and makeup, and the host came down and visited me and said, we're going to have a great show, but Hannah, is it okay? I hear you speak Icelandic. Is it okay if we talk a little in Icelandic before we do the rest of the interview in English? And that was a moment for me where I thought, oh yeah, this is my way in. This is how I've been admitted. And perhaps if I have a right to tell this story, this is how I've earned it through my understanding of the language. And so we did that, and it's been a really interesting process. I think one of the things I have had to do is be very open with the fact that I don't pretend to know everything, that this is still a novel, and that while many, many people might see it now as the dominant narrative, there are others out there, and anyone who wants to learn more should access the same sources I accessed, which is still available. So I think maybe that's it. I try not to be too I try not to claim this story as my own too much. Just say, well, I'm one of many who have made a contribution, and now you can make up your mind.
The success of the book, of course, has given you some great experiences. You write in the memoir about having fun on the tour, and not so much the the big parties. In fact, whenever you describe one of those parties, you always seem to describe either leaving early or sort of popping out to a quiet alcove to have a conversation one-on-one. The joy of it for you seemed to be this simple reward of knowing that people have read your words and enjoyed them, and you can talk to them about that. Given the topic on this tour isn't history or fiction, it's memoir, it's your life. Has that made it more fun or less?
Well, I haven't had I'm still quite early on since this book has came out. It came out about a week ago. And so I'm still getting used to talking about it. It feels quite a strange thing in some ways to be able to speak of my own life as a central kind of theme, I guess. I really had to eat my words when this memoir came out, because I remember telling friends of mine that I would never write a memoir, because I felt then, and to a certain extent I still do feel this way, that my life is just not interesting enough. Yes, I'm a writer and I think that I have these deep thoughts, but I'm not doing really anything quite extraordinary. And I certainly didn't think anyone would be interested. And the only reason this book came out was because the concept didn't really leave me alone. In the same way, my novels were these ideas that would start to kind of follow me about, and eventually I just get to the point where I'm like, oh, fine, then I'll write it down. But yeah, I do feel slightly uncomfortable, I guess, with the specific gaze on my own life. But it also makes me think how glad I am that in this, the rewriting process of this memoir, I decided to cut a lot of what I have written. Being new to the genre, I hadn't realized how important it is to set your boundaries, both in terms of, what you're going to cover, but also in terms of how much personal information are you going to reveal. And I remember when Burial Rites and my other novels came out, there were always a couple of things that would happen through the writing process or research process or even event when I was touring around with them. And I would think to myself, oh, that one's for me. I'm not going to relate this as an anecdote. That's going to be my little sacred thing that I get to keep for myself. And so much of this book was a realization, and in many ways is a telling of many of those stories that I've kept to myself and now finally feel ready to share. But even still, again, within this memoir, I mentioned all the writing I've chucked out. Most of that is information, say, for example, about relationships or about something that was slightly still connected to the central themes, but slightly outside, that tight trinity of Iceland, writing, and, my relationship to both. And so, yeah, I'm very, very glad I did take that out. I think it still would have been good content, but now those are the stories that they're mine. Maybe one day down the road I'll feel ready to tell them, but yeah, I'm glad I cut them from the pages. And that helps, I think, whenever you're feeling slightly exposed or you're feeling vulnerable in talking about your story or talking about your family. I think to myself, well, they don't know everything.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and talking about yourself, writing about yourself, given what you've just said. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've loved it.
That was novelist Hannah Kent on the latest Good Weekend Talks. You can hear Kent speak this Sunday at the Melbourne Writers' Festival. Coming soon on the show, we chat with globally renowned sleep expert Professor Matthew Walker about rest and reinvigoration, dreams and creativity. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts, and keep tuning in for more compelling conversations. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Proud newsrooms powered by subscriptions. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Konrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mummery, with technical assistance from Cormac Lally. Tammy Mills is our executive producer, Tom McKendrick is head of audio, and Greg Callahan is the acting editor of Good Weekend.